Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats. Thank you very much. We'll be starting in a minute's time.
Just come through.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats, or we'll just start without you. Thank you. Well, you can go on the right or the left.
Do you want to go in the middle?
No, I'll go on the side. So.
Okay. That's kind of crowded.
Ladies and gentlemen, hopefully it's... Yep. Ladies and gentlemen, we're just going to start talking. So if you could please take your seats. Otherwise, yep. Thank you so much. For our next panel, I am honoured to be joined by two people who last shared a stage, I think, at this very venue 6 years ago, back when everything was wonderful and lovely and we'd never heard of COVID or Partygate or Donald Trump's second term. I mean, they really don't need any introduction, but George Osborne is obviously former Chancellor of the Exchequer, now one of the country's part of the only thing in this country which is growing, which is the podcasting sector, in particularly the two middle-aged politicians talking to each other. Part of the, but his podcast is award-winning and excellent, and I will resist the temptation to break off 20 minutes in to advertise British Airways to make him feel at home. Professor Sir Neil Ferguson is one of Britain's leading historians, possibly even the leading political historian, a public intellectual. I'm not sure what his view is on that phrase, but writes for the Times and the Free Press. Recently managed to get into a Twitter war with the Vice President of the United States and the richest man in the world at the same time over his disgraceful proposition that Ukraine was invaded by Russia and is not the bad guy in this situation. Obviously, there will be a lot of Trump talk coming up, but ideally, we can also talk more broadly about the state of the centre-right and the Conservative Party reform and what else you think. So, but let me start with a more broad question. And by the way, I'd really like the two of you to talk to each other and just leave me out of it so I can catch up on my emails. George, the two of you used to be pretty close. I mean, Neil, you've said you...
We still are.
Yes. No,
Are we?
But
Is it all over?
Well, let's see in an hour's time.
Yeah. I mean, Neil, you said you voted for Brexit, although you regret that decision because of...
No, he voted Remain.
So he voted Remain.
I voted
Then he
Remain.
regretted it, and now he probably thinks he did the right thing.
Yeah.
This is a myth, actually, that I regretted it.
We've got off to a good start.
This is a myth put about by Andrew Roberts mostly. All I ever said was that we lost and it was time to move on and that you couldn't relitigate Brexit. But George and I were entirely on the same side, and some of you may want to boo at this point. But I supported the Remain campaign, partly because I was not convinced at all by our mutual friend Dan Hannon's economic arguments for leave. And I remember making the decision on the basis of reading all that he'd written about it and concluding that I wasn't persuaded. So I'm an economic historian. I think about things in economic ways. And my feeling at that time, back in the distant days of 2016, was that it would be more costly than beneficial. And I still think that's true, but we lost. And having lost, and I think we lost because non-economic arguments prevailed, the correct position was to accept that as one is taught to accept defeat. And as a Scotsman, I'm very accustomed to accepting defeat.
They probably exhibited William Wallace's body in this building at some point. No, actually, it's not a bad starting point, because I think one of the challenges for the Conservative Party, which obviously I care deeply about and gave me, the best years of my career, and it's actually fantastic to be here with the CPS, who I got so many good ideas from over the years I was active in politics. So I think one of the things the Conservative Party did, both at the sort of Brexit vote, though of course 2/3 of Conservative MPs voted Remain and the majority of the cabinet and whatever voted Remain, but the most sort of credible Brexity argument in that referendum was, we don't think this will be better for the economy, but we value other things. We value our sovereignty, we value control of our borders. That was, if you listen to the most intelligent of the Brexit arguments, it was that. It wasn't a claim that Britain would be economically better off. It was in some ways a way of kind of trying to take the sting out of the economic argument which I was running as the Chancellor at the time. And I think if you look at the Conservative Party's story ever since that 2016 vote, it's often not put business and the economy first. And I think that's been one of its big challenges and remains a big challenge today. So the campaign that won sort of saw big business as part of the blob or the people they had defeated, and the business organisations were dismissed in the same way as the kind of trade unions and the civil service. This was the establishment that these insurgents had beaten. And then you get to the actual kind of Theresa May Parliament and Boris's election. And again, every attempt to put an economic argument for staying in the single market, which Dan Hannon used to advocate, staying in the customs union, which had never been aired during the campaign, was relegated in pursuit of something purer, which was sovereignty and parliamentary control. And so again, the economy took second place. Then you get to the 2019 election, and what is the Conservative Party's central election message other than get Brexit done? It's we're going to spend more money on police officers, more money on hospitals, right? 40 more hospitals, all about inputs and public expenditure. You then get to COVID, and for very understandable reasons, you want to protect the population through that period. And business, by the way, during this period is told to F off. Right? And at each stage of the Conservative story, business is not regarded as the most important thing. The economy is not the number one issue until suddenly it is, but by this point it's late in the Parliament and it's close to election. We're probably going to talk about it, the quasi-Kwarteng mini-budget. And even when you get to the kind of general election campaign in last year, the message is still around immigration control. I'm not saying it's not important, stop the boats, but where's the big economic message? And I think fundamentally, if you've gone back to the 1970s and the CPS and its work with Margaret Thatcher in opposition, at the heart of it was an economic message. There were lots of other important things in society, but if I was trying to rebuild the opposition, I would start with an economic message.
And of course, Trump's message was actually one about living standards as much as anything else.
Well, if you want to understand how Donald Trump got a second term, it's really quite simple. The Biden administration, or Biden-Harris administration as they used to call it, made a huge blunder that led to 9% inflation by the summer of 2022. And they threw open the southern border so that net 8 million people arrived in the United States, more or less all of them illegally. And so that was it. That was really a sufficient explanation for Trump's victory. As is often the case, the victor overinterprets the result and concludes that, in fact, he has a mandate for all 36 of the very radical policy proposals that the Trump campaign published. They published them in video format. You can get Donald Trump to lay out his position on any issue you like. Go back to the campaign website, it's all there. But the voters saw none of those videos because the Harris campaign decided to ignore the content of Trump's campaign. They entirely ignored the content, and they tried to go after the character of Donald Trump. At first, they tried to say that he was Hitler, and once again, as in 2016-17, the voters weren't buying. Then they did lawfare, and that actually completely backfired in a way that was predictable. But they didn't actually go against the things that Trump proposed to do. So the result was that he got elected for those two economic reasons, inflation and migration, and the radical things that Trump intended to do were barely discussed. Now we're shocked to find that Donald Trump is a protectionist, as if he hasn't been telling us that since 1987.
He took out a full-page advert in the New York Times that year.
He did. He's also consistently argued that our American allies are essentially free riders. He's made that argument since the mid-1980s. And so to act shocked when Trump comes in and does tariffs and beats up on American allies is, I think, a little ingenuous. But the explanation is straightforward. The problem for the Trump administration is that, in some ways, the Biden-Harris administration set them up to fail. And it set them up to fail in a couple of interesting ways. First, the fiscal recklessness of the preceding 4 years has created not only a debt-to-GDP ratio north of 100%, highest it's been since after World War II, but a deficit in excess of 6% of GDP at full employment. That is a huge fiscal mess that it will be extremely difficult for Scott Bessent to clear up as Treasury Secretary, even without all that Trump is doing on trade. The second problem was, and I think I see Sahil Matani in the audience, he pointed this out to me, one reason we did not have a recession, which every economist predicted, in the United States in 2023 or 2024, was that 8 million people were added to the workforce. And they not only were illegal immigrants, they were almost immediately absorbed into the US workforce. And that was one of the reasons the GDP growth surprised to the upside. You stop that, and we have stopped that, and it was stopped even before Trump was sworn in, you are going to have a significant supply-side shock. So the Trump predicament was already tricky economically, even before he decided to do full trade war. Full trade war makes it even tougher. Because we're now looking at, just going back to George's point, it's the economy. If you take Trump literally, and it's always quite a good idea to do that, as well as seriously, you could either take the average tariff rate back to where it was in 1943, that's if you kept the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, or you could go back to 1937 if you fully follow through on the idea of reciprocal tariffs, which we'll find out about on April the 2nd. These are hugely disruptive shocks to the US economy and to the economy of its trading partners. It's very hard to find anybody on Wall Street who thinks this is a good idea. And it's very easy to find people who say, you know, we were glad Trump won, but this is crazy. Because this is going to be so disruptive, it creates so much uncertainty that nobody can make an investment decision. And that trade policy uncertainty was something that people underestimated prior to Trump's re-election. Then they underestimated it right up to the inauguration. I'll say one last thing. What happened under Biden and Harris was unsustainable. And she would have been a disastrous president. It was not a difficult decision to vote for Donald Trump if the choice was Trump or Harris. The vibe shift, the mood swing that happened in the US after the election results came through was nationwide, very powerful, unmistakable. Because people generally agreed that what the progressive wing of the Democratic Party had been able to do with a senile president was mostly entirely unpalatable and unsustainable. So people got what they wanted. And you can see that in the fact that almost every demographic swung to Trump and away from the Democrats, with the exception of, I think it's single white women with cats. Everybody else moved to Trump. And I think what happened in the subsequent period after he was sworn in was in some measure the buyer's remorse problem, which is, whew, we avoided the Harris presidency. And then people realized sometime in late January, mid-February, we have the second Trump term.
I mean, it's weird you to say that cat ladies swung Democrats. I mean, I think they'd have been worried about migrants eating the cats, which was apparently
They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats.
But
that was a very brilliant example of why Trump is an astonishing once-in-a-century political talent, because every expert person who watched the debate between him and Harris said that he was destroyed by her, that she had gone after him quite successfully as a prosecutor would. But all that anybody remembered 3 days later about that debate was, they're eating the pets, they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs. It was even set to music. My son played me all kinds of entertaining meme versions. That's modern politics. And it's worth saying, just in response to something George said, it is the economy. If you get that wrong, you will pay. And Trump will pay if he continues to get it wrong this year. They'll pay in the midterms next year. But you also have to combine economics with the new politics of the internet. There's only one person in the world who's really getting this right: Javier Milei. So Javier Milei is the real thing. He does Thatcherite economics. He's transforming Argentina. He's doing all the difficult things that the British Conservatives wouldn't do, that I don't think the American Republicans do. He's tackled Argentina's unsustainable finances, but he's doing it with this incredibly intuitive grasp of how to sell politics in the 2020s, with memes, with videos, with slogans, and that's a remarkable thing, unique in the world.
So, George, I mean, this is something I was going to ask a bit later, but I mean, you were here last time the Conservative Party were in opposition. You were one of the people who led them out of the wilderness by effectively moving them closer to the centre, moving them closer to Tony Blair. You called him the master, I believe. Is that the same recipe today, or is Neil right that things have changed and the spirit of the age is not where it was?
Well, in some ways it's an easier task today because Tony Blair had a 42% poll lead back then, not 14 or 4. And, this Labour government have not taken to office with anything like the alacrity that Blair and Brown did back then. And, by the way, sealed the deal with the entrepreneurial class by cutting CGT and cutting corporation tax. It was a really hard government to be in opposition to. And I was there as William Hague's political secretary and working for Michael Howard and then working with David Cameron. And, I spent the first 9 years as an MP in opposition. And I remember something right when we started in opposition in 1997. John Howard, the then very successful Australian Prime Minister, came and saw William Hague, and I was like the little note-taker in the back of the room. And he said, you know what, the Conservatives will think that opposition's quite fun, They'll be enjoying it at the moment. That's the first year of opposition, and then the next year gets worse, and the year after gets worse, and the year after gets worse, and the year after gets worse. And then, I can see various familiar faces here in the first couple of rows of tables who were with us during that journey. Opposition is really hard and gets more and more depressing. And the Conservative Party has a really big mountain to climb. And despite the problems that the Labour government has, the truth is the Conservative Party got its worst results since 1832. Right? I mean, a historic defeat, right? A crashing historic defeat. And you have to kind of start, if you're the Conservative opposition, of thinking, where do I want to be at the next election? Not where do I need to be today and where do I need to be tomorrow? And there's huge pressure on the opposition leader, and I have a lot of sympathy for Kemi Badenoch on this. And she's trying to achieve something that hasn't been achieved since the 1970s, which is an opposition leader coming out of an election where their party's kicked into opposition and then they win 4 or 5 years later. That's not been achieved since then. If you think of all the Labour opposition leaders in the 80s and the Tory opposition leaders in the 90s and then the Labour opposition leaders again in the recent period. It's really hard to do it in one term, but you have to start with where do I want to be at the next election? And you have to show enormous resilience, and you have to hold your nerve and not worry about what people are saying about you today and tomorrow, because there will be lots of where's Kemi and why is she not saying anything, whatever. Everyone is going to know who the leader of the Conservative Party is come the election day in 4 or 5 years' time. The question is, what are they going to think about that person? And have they got the party onto the issues that are going to be relevant in that general election? And I'll give you, just because they're not going to be the things you necessarily hear at this conference, I'll give you, so the economy you will be talking about at this conference, right? And it's got to be front and centre. Whatever Labour does, people are not going to feel much better off at the end of this Parliament. That's now clear. So where is your economic plan to reassure people that you're not going to trash the economy, you're not going to have a repeat of the Liz Truss disaster, which has done enormous damage to the Conservative Party's reputation, not unlike Black Wednesday, back when I was in opposition, years earlier, and you keep saying, well, it's a totally different set of people, and what's it got to do with us? But Labour will keep going back to it. So you've got to have your economic policy, and you've got to have some plan that's both reassuring and has some promise the upside. But I'll tell you 2 other things, which you won't hear in this conference. NHS, election after election that I fought and lost in opposition, we got hung on the NHS in the final weeks of the campaign. And you could argue even in 2010, one of the reasons we didn't get a majority was the attack from Labour that the Tories, if they get in, are going to destroy the NHS. They'll say the last time they were in, there was massive queues. You let these people in, they're going to cut spending, they're going to cut the NHS. And it took, David Cameron literally saying, my political priorities can be summed up in 3 letters, NHS, to reassure people. That is always one of the biggest obstacles to the Conservative Party coming back. And I'll tell you the other obstacle, and again, no one will want to hear it in this hall. There are 73 Liberal Democrat MPs. 73 Liberal Democrat MPs. And we did all sorts of things in the opposition from 2005 onwards, David became the leader, to try and win the Liberal Democrat voters over. Vote Blue, Go Green, hug the Liberal Democrats. Eric Pickles ran a brilliant campaign around that as our party chair at the time. But what people forget, because subsequently there was a coalition, that effort failed. In the 2010 election, the Liberal Democrats basically got the same number of seats as they had done 5 years earlier. A couple fewer, but basically the same. And our whole effort to win back Liberal Democrat marginals failed. Now, the one thing it had done, that campaign, was set us up actually to be in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. Because we'd been saying the right kind of things, and they thought, we were their kind of people and so on. Something that ultimately in 2015 they learned to their cost we weren't. But you've got to, if you're sitting there and you're just thinking about how am I going to win, not how am I going to be a think tank or an opinion column in the Daily Telegraph, but how am I actually going to get this party into 10 Downing Street? What's your Liberal Democrat strategy? There's a lot of focus on your reform strategy, which I understand, and that's a bigger challenge than David had to face or the opposition leaders before him. So I have a lot of sympathy for that problem. We can come on and talk about it. But what's your Liberal Democrat policy? How are you going to get back 73 MPs? How are you going to make sure, if it's a hung parliament, that Ed Davey might put a Conservative leader into 10 Downing Street rather than a Labour leader. Create some optionality. And if you're like, we're not doing that, we don't want anything to do with these people, fine, but you are reducing your chances quite substantially in that case of there being a Conservative government after the election. Because Keir Starmer's got two routes to winning at the moment. He can get a majority again, or he can do a deal with the Liberal Democrats. And what's our option? What's our route? Like, win an outright majority, which at the moment seems like a historic task.
Do you know, as you're talking, George, I'm thinking, isn't it ironic that after Brexit, British politics has become more European in its character, so that the situation of the Conservative Party is pretty much analogous with the situation of the Christian Democrats in Germany, where they have to worry about the party to the right of them, but also the party to the left of them, and where coalition options become really the only options after a certain point. Fragmentation of British politics into a multi-party system is one of these things that happens without British people quite noticing. They don't realise that there hasn't been a two-party system in this country since we were kids.
Well, there was very briefly, but it was entirely Brexit-driven.
And entirely Brexit-driven and therefore ephemeral process. And we've reverted to having something which looks much more like a European system. It's just that it has first past the post, which produced the illusion of a massive Labour victory. But it was an illusion if one actually looked at the popular vote, where Labour barely moved at all. So, I mean, in that sense, I think this Labour government is weak, much weaker than the Blair government was in its first term. I think this is a government with a glass jaw. I think it cannot deliver economically. It's clear that it's incapable of doing the things that you would have to do to get the British economy growing again. And what strikes me is that in addition to having become quite European in its political structure, we've also ended up with problems that are familiar to me from the 1970s. When I went back and looked at the early years of CPS and went back to Keith Joseph's seminal lecture on inflation, it was amazing to me that much of what he said could be said again about the situation of Britain. And I have to say that
But it's not being said, is it?
It's not. My strongest piece of advice to Kemi Badenoch, whom I strongly back for the leadership, is we have to remember what worked about Thatcherism. Maybe you don't call it Thatcherism because the word Thatcher has been so demonised, not least by liberals. But the core idea that you've got to get the British economy growing again, you've got to get it growing by encouraging business, by incentivising entrepreneurship, by lifting the burdens, all of the things that were at the heart of Thatcherism, which were much more important in the 1970s, remember, because the European issue had, as it seemed, been settled, than we tend to remember.
But I agree, but, you know, look at I mean, obviously I feel a bit party-pree about this, but every Tory leader and the 6 Tory chancellors that came after me were all like, we're not going back to the age of austerity. Okay, well, fine, what does that mean? A bigger state. You know, the state reduced in income as a share of national income while I was Chancellor from 45% to 39%.
Your tragedy, right, George, was you let them call it austerity, and that label stuck, even though what you were doing was trying to deal with a very serious public
By the way,
problem.
we self-labelled it austerity, won an election on it, right? And by the way, you look at the size of the civil service by the time I left office in the Treasury, it was dramatic. It was half what it is today, and that growth has not happened under the recent Labour months. And you know, we've got to remake those arguments. And I come back to, you know, where is our education policy that is focused on the parents and the pupils rather than the teachers? Where's the health policy that's focused on the patients? Right? Why is our election slogan 40 more hospitals? I mean, maybe we should have 40 fewer hospitals. What we want is better health care. You know, not just like inputs and they were like, I can't even remember the slogan now, 50,000 more police officers. Well, you know, we used to make an argument we needed fewer police officers because we could cut crime by doing, you know, making a more efficient use of the police.
But we didn't have non-crime hate incidents in those days. But you've got to have the police for those.
Yeah, well, that all seemed to happen while there were Conservative Home Secretaries. So there's, you know, I just think you have to get back to focusing on the consumer, being radical about public service reform. Certainly where I would point, you know, if I look at the previous period of opposition, 13 years, By the time we got finally into office in 2010 and we were able to look back on those 13 years, the work that think tanks like the CPS, Policy Exchange and others had done on education reform was invaluable when we got to office. The work that's done on welfare reform, around universal credit, invaluable when we got into office. It's so hard when you're in office to generate these thoughts. So, but public service reform basically ground to a halt about 6-7 years ago. What is the Tory party's education policy or health policy or whatever? You've got to, that is really valuable work that can be done in opposition. It can be done in a way that's not frightening to voters. It can be done in a way that is, whoever is the next Tory education secretary can go, let's use all that thinking we did in opposition. And it's around structures, and it's around what you're delivering for the users of these services, not just how much money you're putting into it, or how many teachers you're employing, or how many schools you're building.
Investment. I mean, the question is, how do you get the investment up? Again, it's simple when you think about it as an economic problem. The terrific Foundations report that was published last year makes it clear that this country has systematically underestimated in housing, in energy infrastructure, and in its transportation. Compare it with France, and you can see the problem. And then you add in the large-scale net migration. That explains why everybody thinks Britain is broken, because it looks broken. It's not been invested in, and we've increased the population through an immigration policy that will look like one of the biggest mistakes of the Conservative governments post-2016. So the most important question that Kemi Badenoch has to answer is, how are we going to raise investment in Britain so that all of these problems get addressed? The good thing is that Labour cannot do it. Labour cannot do it because one important thing you have to do is make sure that you don't get the unions, and the particularly public sector unions, vetoing what needs to be done. The obstacles to large-scale investment in this country look, to me, quite obvious. Dysfunctional systems of planning, bureaucracy, all of these things, unfortunately for us, are rather closely aligned with the Labour movement. It's not Labour that is going to tackle these problems. They'll talk about it in the same way that they'll talk about doing something about our greatly weakened defence capabilities, but they won't be able to deliver. And I think it's going to be that delta between promises and delivery that makes Keir Starmer vulnerable. But only if, and here I agree with George, only if the Conservatives have a coherent story about why they'll be able to deliver what Labour has failed to deliver.
But it feels like, I mean, from earlier sessions to today and your conversation slightly, it feels like there were two sort of separate narratives here almost about what the Conservatives and what the future of Conservatism is. One is, I wrote about this in the Sunday Times a while back. It's a sort of attitude to institutions. Is the Conservative Party about conserving things? Is it the party of defending what exists, defending institutions? The OBR, for example. Is it a sort of radical, creatively destructive, insurgent force channeling popular anger? Essentially, is it a party of the haves or the have-nots? And I think that is sort of one of the fundamental tensions that's within our. Maybe
it's the party of the want-to-haves, the people who want to accumulate, want to be, are ambitious for themselves and their families, and the Conservative Party at its best sweeps away all the obstacles to those, even if those obstacles are institutions or established hierarchies or aristocracies or whatever. I mean, that's the. We all have our sort of favourite, one of my heroes is staring down at me here, William Pitt. But I think the Disraeli quote, there's a Disraeli quote from like the 1870s where he says, I'm going to paraphrase it, but change in a progressive country is constant, and the question is not whether that change happens, which is irresistible, but whether the change happens consistent with the principles and traditions of a country, or is arbitrary and applied and delivered through abstract principles. And the second bit being the left, and the first bit being conservative. So I think Conservatives can lean into change, not resist change. They're not the no change party, but do it in a way that is broadly consistent with the institutions of the country, and a respect for the rule of law, and a respect for things are done in an orderly way, and where it's very dangerous when conservatism sort of switches into a kind of smash the institutions, I personally think that's quite risky. Now, of course, Margaret Thatcher, I know the conference is in honour of her. You know, she stands out there as the kind of example of the great Tory radical, and the British state was broken in the 70s. So she always makes you think, like, should we be pushing to be more radical? But ultimately, I think you do have to be careful if you completely unanchor yourself from the history of the country, or you're just more likely to become a cropper and not succeed and not understand why others have failed to do what you think is an easy thing to do.
But I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy that you came up with there, Rob, because ultimately what Margaret Thatcher was very good at going after were the new institutions that had arisen with tremendous speed after 1945.
Yeah, the central plan.
New institutions of corporate, bureaucratic planning, which empowered the unions and institutionalized what was in effect the dead hand of the state. So her radicalism was directed against that ultimately disastrous post-war consensus that big government was the answer and the man from Whitehall knew best. What she was appealing to was, in fact, an earlier kind of conservatism, something that made me think back to the interwar period, when there was a great deal more dynamism in the British economy, when we didn't have a national...
We built houses, for one thing.
We built houses, and we're very good at building houses. And that's one of the things that struck me as I was reading the Foundation's report, that in fact it's only relatively recently that Britain lost the ability to invest and innovate and build and have a really good health service. And most of the great mistakes were made in the period after 1945, especially in the 70s. Thatcher did a huge amount to roll back that blob, that newly formed post-war blob. The tragedy of the period after her departure from power was how much it came back. To an extent that they conceal, the Labour Party is still the party of the blob, and it still aspires to do things that ordinary people regard as mad. This is going to happen in education. Once it becomes apparent exactly what Labour's agenda is for education, people will realise what is under threat. The reforms that Michael Gove so successfully achieved in his time at education. So I think in a way Labour will play into the Conservatives' hands because it's committed to radical ideas and the power of the state. What will make the Conservative Party credible is if it goes after that. And you can go after the blob, you can go after the corporate, bureaucratic, red tape state and still cherish the traditional institutions of the country, which Disraeli was talking about, and which Roger Scruton, the late lamented Roger Scruton, was so good at reminding us of. Let me give you a perspective.
Well, sometimes, we're good at inventing traditions, aren't we? I mean,
well, yes.
Every successful revolution presents itself as a restoration.
It's true, and yet, let me just give you a transatlantic perspective. I spent most of the last 20 plus years working in the US. Coming back and being in England again, I'm struck by a fundamental difference. We do have ancient institutions that are deeply embedded, organically embedded, in every town and village in the country. It's not like that in the US. American conservatives are trying to conserve a revolutionary republic with a very good constitution. They're not trying to conserve the rule of law dating back to Magna Carta. They're not trying to preserve a church and a monarchy and a system of government that is truly ancient. So conservatism in this country has a quite different feel to it. And that's, I think, a strength. And I'm very struck by the fact that that's still there wherever I go. I'm not just talking about London. I'm talking about going to provincial Britain. You sense that tradition is still there. It's there at the village level. It's there in the pub. It's there if you go to church. It's there if you talk to local people. They are still deeply committed to a certain vision of Britain, a vision of England, that has not been effaced by all the efforts of the central planners and the bureaucrats in Whitehall.
I think you might have the nuns cycling through the mist or whatever, and the whack
No, I'm just sitting down. I'm sitting. No. You don't need to mock it. I know you're a very metropolitan guy, Jordan. You don't get out to the country very often.
I do that.
Come and visit us in the country one day, and I'll show you that it's true.
But you mentioned the judiciary there. I mean, the judiciary now are making equal pay rulings that a shelf stacker is doing the same job as a warehouse worker, and what they're actually paid and what the market will pay for their services is irrelevant to whether those are equal jobs. The judiciary is saying we have to sell the Chagos Islands. The judiciary is saying that is steadily expanding the generosity of the asylum and immigration system. I mean, that is the thing. If you talk to these sort of angry young men who sort of tend to turn up to the CPS to drink or wine, that is the sort of thing which gets them under the...
Well, in a way, the lawyers have taken over from where the trade unionists were in the 1970s. They have the real power, but they shouldn't have that much power. But that's wrong.
But, George, I was going to ask you about one new institution in particular, which is the Climate Change Committee and the Net Zero apparatus. I mean, you said, obviously, one of the things that you did with David Cameron was vote blue, go green. You went off to the North Pole. But
not personally, but yes.
I couldn't remember who was on the trip. But I mean, it feels like that is one area where there has been a vibe shift recently. I mean, is that something that you think is a mistake, or?
Well, I think I think back to those arguments. I mean, first of all, there's a difference between opposition and government. So in opposition, what you're trying to do, everything you say is not actually going to happen. You're trying to communicate something about yourself and about the kind of values you have and the kind of people you'll be if you get into government. That's really important because, I used to, when I was in my 20s, work for all these shadow cabinet ministers who were probably recently ex-cabinet, and remember, none of them survived. I mean, by the time we got to 2010, I think only William Hague maybe had been in the cabinet, and Ken Clarke was brought back as a later but most of the, that initial shadow cabinet looks so different from the shadow cabinet that finally got elected, and the same would be true, of course, of Labour today. There are one or two survivors from the last time Labour in office, but very few. So you're trying to say things about yourself, and we were trying to say that this Conservative Party is interested in your environment. Remember, it was not just climate change. It was also about your local environment, and we used to have those big things where we would go and clean up a park to show that we were getting involved in communities, that we were not people who were distant from the communities we lived in, social action projects that Steve Hilton pioneered. And it was all about trying to show a different kind of set of values. The Conservative Party, arguably ancient Conservative values of conserving and protecting the environment. Then, in government, of course, we had lots of rows. David Cameron's famous for saying green crap, right, at some point. And certainly as Chancellor, I was like, what it actually costs to sign up to these things? And I'm all for moving in the direction of that. But, the reason why I wanted a new nuclear power station built in the west of England, which was hugely controversial at the time, everyone said it was either a waste of money or, not worth doing, or but now, it is being built, and thankfully not being built at the taxpayers' expense. We did push for things that were, I think, bore in mind the cost of the transition. And I think you can have a similar approach today. The risk, though, is this. Government does not have many levers, and to Neil's point about getting investment in, of course there are things that government can directly spend money on, right? But they're pretty limited. I mean, the government's investment budget, even if you increased it, is still a fraction of what the private sector invests. And to get the private sector investing in a consistent way, certainly on anything that's going to take several years to build, you have to reassure the private sector that the rules aren't going to change, that you're not just going to ditch this latest idea and come up with another one or scrap it. And, the history of British transport infrastructure is riddled with schemes that didn't conclude, things that were never seen through, and that then puts a pull on decisions for the next 20 years. These things are, in a mature democracy, in a crowded island, these things are quite hard to get delivered. But once you're delivering them, you need to stick with them. And the same is true of energy infrastructure. How can you expect, a big energy company which has got options of investing all around the world to come and invest here if you're chopping and changing all the time? So, yes, we can think, well, that's gone too far, or maybe we should delay that target. But if you just scrap the whole thing, people are just going to go, well, this is a totally inconsistent regime, and by the way, in a few years' time, some other bunch of people are going to turn up and restore it all. So you do. I mean, you have to say one of the if you go to one of Britain's greatest advantages, which is the rule of law we were just talking about, that comes with it. Almost every investor you meet who invests money in the UK says one of the things I most love about your country is the rule of law. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, you're all treated equally and fairly. And that's something that most countries would give anything for. But it does require some kind of consistency of approach and some kind of promise. Well, why has there not been a Heathrow runway? Because literally every Prime Minister comes in, Tory or Labour, ditches the initiative of the last. And sometimes
I thought it was because you lot didn't want to lose Boris and Zach's seats and backed HS2 instead.
Yes, but you're right about the Heathrow. I mean, HS2 is a tragedy in my view that we're not continuing with that project. It's going to go to Birmingham, not to Manchester. I'll dig out. I insisted on seeing the Treasury files on the M25. Treasury, totally against the M25. Said it was a total waste of money. We should be investing in mini roundabouts in Hemel Hempstead. That was its and totally against the Channel Tunnel. And of course, the people who built the Channel Tunnel went bust, but thank God it was built. Right? The motorways opposed by the Treasury in the 60s and 70s, like the M6 and the M1 and so on. The Treasury doesn't like these big schemes, and they're often overrun, and they are expensive. But ultimately they deliver major improvements. HS1, which many Conservative MPs bitterly fought against. There is an HS1. It's now called the Javelin Line in Kent. It's the fast-speed line to the Channel Tunnel. It's the reason why those places like Margate have been regenerated. Huge row in the Tory party for ages about building HS1. So there is a kind of problem with those big infrastructure projects. So they're very controversial. They have to be slightly dirigiste. You have to insist on them. And you have to resist, let's, put a tunnel through, 100 miles of Tory seats in Oxfordshire or Northamptonshire, rather, because the local MP, has got a difficult town hall meeting coming up.
One of the most striking things that's happened since 2008 is the gap that's opened between Britain and America, not just politically but economically. I mean, GDP per capita in the UK had got as close to America as it had for a very long time. And since then, despite George's best efforts running the economy, the gap has widened, and especially in the last few years. And obviously there is lots and lots of things about America that we can't replicate. What is it about America or the other places in the world which are growing quickly that we could and should be copying? I mean, Neil, you've already talked about our ability to build things, but is there anything more sort of spiritual?
Well, two things worth saying. I mean, first of all, the US has pulled ahead of everybody. It's pulled ahead of Europe as well as the UK. It's pulled ahead of the other G7 countries. So there's something here that is not really a story of British failure, but American success, American outperformance. And the second thing is that when you ask, what is it? The answer is not what you probably immediately think. Oh, they've just got all these amazing resources. There are many parts of the world with amazing natural resources. That's not the thing. The thing that is distinctive about the United States is that the federal system allows competition. So that even if they decide to govern California in a completely dysfunctional, disastrous way, you can go to Texas. And Texas shows what energy policy can be if you simply allow the private sector to get on with it. That's where the most spectacular advances have been in so-called renewables. And that's, I think, a perfect illustration of what the United States has that we lack. We don't have an experimental laboratory where one part of the country can do sane free market policies, even if the other part of the country decides to do socialism. That's a very, very big difference. But you spend time in the United States, as I have, and I've lived in blue states, and I've spent time in red states, I spend a lot of time in Texas these days, but I've been in Massachusetts, I've been in California, I've been in New York. The blue states are disastrously governed. Go to Chicago if you want to see how to destroy a great city. Or spend some time in San Francisco, where the Democrats have dedicated themselves to destroying one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And they can do that. Gavin Newsom, who's been a catastrophic governor of California, can come up with all kinds of insane ideas that leave where I spent much of the last 7 years, a kind of hellscape. San Francisco is a city you wouldn't go to. The woodlands around us are in danger of going up in flames because there's no sane management of woodland. Environmental policies make it impossible to build almost anything. They can't, you think I have problems building a railway here? The high-speed railway in California is the epic illustration of total governmental dysfunction. But that's just California. You go to Texas and stuff works. If you want to develop, build housing, invest in new energy, you can do it. And the government will encourage you. So the biggest problem we have is that we have a highly centralized system where you basically get variations on socialism. You want a little hard stuff, go up to Scotland. You want a lighter version, spend time in England. But it's the same basic model. So there's no competition. When my friends in Silicon Valley got utterly pissed off with the Democrats, and they did finally get utterly pissed off with them, they left. Elon left. Joe Lonsdale left. They're in Texas now. And their tax dollars are not going to California anymore. So I know it's not fashionable to say it, but federalism looks good from an American vantage point. It's the reason that the Democrats haven't been able to destroy all of America, which they would certainly have tried to do if Kamala had been elected.
But you could try. I mean, I think the elected mayors in England, whilst nothing like as powerful a federal system as the United States, are a route back. And remember, if you think of like the Conservative revival in opposition, it starts in local government. It starts in winning them. Boris's win in London in 2008 was a big indicator that the Conservatives were coming back. And so, you probably, it's when the Conservatives start winning back, like the mayoralty of the West Midlands or, some of the other mayoralties that are being created, which we should win. So you can, some local experimentation. I mean, fundamentally, I don't think Britain has the tolerance that a Texas has for the, for sort of, I know this will be a characterization which you'll pick me up on, but, basically sort of a limited safety net. And our safety net is riddled with holes and so on. But, I think we as a country, we were better placed somewhere.
But we have a safety net, which is a comfort blanket.
I know.
And millions of people who should be working are not working because of bogus mental health claims. You can't do that in Texas.
And, but why?
And guess what? That really works.
No, but that requires tough welfare reform.
Yeah. Well, the government's talking about doing it. It'd be pretty embarrassing for the Conservatives if any kind of welfare reform gets done by a Labour government.
No,
that is going to be embarrassing.
So you do have to, these things are difficult to do. But I don't think the Conservative Party should not lose sight of its basic principles, which it believes in enterprise and business. I've made that point. We don't tell business to F off. We work alongside business, right? We believe in smaller state, not promising ever more public expenditure, right? That requires difficult decisions on things like the welfare state, right? And not endlessly siding with those who want to avoid cuts and whatever. And free trade and not being afraid at the moment. Again, we're very, if we were sitting here in Kiev, of course, we would be utterly transfixed by what was going on in the White House. It would be absolutely critical to our nation's future. But if we were in a Conservative conference, thinking about where we're going to be in 2028, 29, when there's a general election, right? This is either after Trump or right at the tail end of Trump. And I would be starting to establish some basic things that Conservatives have, by and large, with the odd wayward moment in our history, believed in, which is free trade's a good thing, right? Free trade's a good thing. Tariffs are a bad thing. We're not afraid to say so, and start to establish some things which are, I think, going to come back into fashion certainly within 4 years.
But individual liberty, family, that's the stuff that really matters. And that's one of the things that you learn if you spend time in the United States, that the appeal of republicanism is not just to free market. It's not just that. Yeah. The appeal of the Republican Party is that we believe in the individual freedom and the family. And we don't hear nearly enough about that from European conservatives. We're kind of embarrassed to talk about that, but that's what ordinary people hate about the progressive vision of the future. What they hate is the progressive vision of the future knocks on your door on a Sunday and says, we believe you've done an offensive tweet. The reason that J.D. Vance, I mean, I've had my disagreements with J.D. Vance, but the reason I agreed with what he said at Munich is that we've drifted in to a terrible illiberalism. And we've done it. Conservatives have done it. Conservatives have a hand in this. That's a shocking thing. How did we become so numb to the fundamental values of Britishness, the things my grandfathers fought for, that we could allow the police to acquire these ludicrous invasive powers, that we could allow censorship to become something that it was okay for governments to do? How did we lose sight of these very, very fundamental things, which used to be part and parcel of conservatism, but at some point stopped being?
But the lesson of the pandemic is surely that the public were like, come on, lock us up. We love it.
You know, I think if it had been made clear,
I think they were losing their tolerance in the second lockdown.
The hysteria around lockdowns that arose, particularly after another Neil Ferguson, not me, just to be clear, the other guy, after he published his insane imperial paper saying that everybody have to be locked down for the duration until they found a vaccine, which is what the paper said. If somebody had pointed out that that was crazy and that that was going to inflict costs on young British people vastly in excess of the benefits to older British people, I think there would have been an audience for that, but nobody tried. No conservative dared to make that argument, whereas it was much easier to make that argument, though still hard.
I mean, we don't want to relitigate.
I think we should relitigate.
No, I personally...
I think we lost our way in 2020.
No, I mean, I wasn't...
I really do. I think we lost our way.
No, I was not involved in... I wasn't in Parliament or anything. I personally have more sympathy with the decision makers in the spring of 2020 when you've got this completely unknown disease, you don't know how many people it's going to kill, there's no vaccine at the moment, and... You know, the lockdown strategy seemed like the right approach then. I have much less sympathy a year later when you have the vaccine, right, and you're clear that whilst tragically some people have died, it's not, you know, it's a disease that society ultimately can cope with and absorb. And it's more the sort of second half of the decision-making than the first half. You have to have some sympathy for Downing Street in March, April 2020, when it's like, God knows what this disease is going to bring. So... But anyway, we could spend a whole hour talking about it.
I'm afraid we have almost spent a whole hour talking, and I know could spend an hour more. So just in the seconds that remain, your 3 or 4 point plan to save conservatism.
Well, look, you've got to focus on winning, right? The opposition is not about being in opposition, it's about winning. It's about winning enough people at a general election or enough seats at a general election, however you get there. It's obviously better with more votes than fewer votes, but ultimately you want as many seats.
They call you a political genius.
So you've got to like David Cameron's slogan when he became opposition leader, after we tried like 3 other opposition leaders, and he, by the way, was the 5th place candidate in that contest. The Times newspaper advised him to drop out of the contest because he was embarrassing himself at one point. And but the slogan was "Change to win." And if you're in opposition, there's nothing wrong about trying to win. Right? As I say, you're doing a different job from a think tank or a newspaper column, or so that's the first thing. You've got to focus on winning, and you've got to first thing. Second, where is the argument going to be in 2028, not in 2025? Right? Think ahead to what is going to likely be the battleground at the general election. Third, put the economy front and centre. Right? That is the route back for the Conservatives. It always has been, always will be, and start with accepting that we've done a lot of. There's quite a lot of harm that people need to be reassured we've learnt the lesson of. And then, I would do the thinking now on public service reform, because that's invaluable when we get into office, including welfare reform. And finally, it's very easy for me to say this, having, I never led the Conservative Party, but I did work for a lot of opposition leaders and the Prime Minister. I know it's really hard at the moment, but don't worry about what people are saying about you today. Worry about what people are going to say about you in 4 years' time. Everyone is going to know who the leader of the Conservative Party is in 4 years' time when it comes to polling day. Right? And the question is, what do they think about that person? And if Kemi is there, which I see no reason why you'd want to replace her, having just been through a contest, she should be focused on what I want people to think about me then. And if I have to take difficult steps to get myself there, but it's all about focusing on the battle you're going to fight then, and getting through the kind of day-to-day skirmishes of of British politics.
You asked for 3 points. He gave you 5. I'll give you 3.
A politician who delivers more than he promises.
Yeah.
Well, who delivers more promises than he promises. I think the answer is simple. We don't need Trumpism in Britain. We need something much more like Malayism. In other words, we need to say that it is time to get big government out of the way of the private sector, as Malay has said in Argentina. We have
Can
to...
I just go...
No. You had your 5 points,
No, I want to
George.
ask you a genuine question, G, because we've discussed it. I'm full of admiration for Malay, but you know he's operating in Argentina, which is such a different.
We are
country.
closer to Argentina than to the United States. It's time to face that reality.
Yeah.
We have the problems that Argentina has.
Do you think that would
That's
work?
the harsh reality. We're deluding ourselves if we think we have American options. We have the same problems that they have in terms of the excessively bloated state, the corrupt political caste, the obstacles in the face of private owners of property. It's very much closer to Argentina than most people in the British political elite want to admit. But I tell you, if you go to South Wales or you go to central Scotland, that looks a lot more like Argentina than Westminster does.
I just fear that a similar campaign by the Conservative
But let me
Party
finish
would
my
blow
3
up.
points. Let me finish my 3 points. You need to be radical about reigniting the private sector, because Labour is going to fail to do that. We can be sure of that. And so you have to appeal to the entrepreneurial spirit that still exists in this country, even at the small-scale level. Small businesses want to be told, you're going to have electricity that makes your business viable. That's the fundamental thing. And here I agree with you. You began by saying this. I agree with you. But that's only one of the 3. The second thing you have to say is, as Millet says every day, liberty, damn it. Liberty, damn it. Freedom for individuals and their families. That's the second thing that we've got that Labour can never have, because it's completely antithetical to their political ideology. And thirdly, we haven't talked about it enough, Britain needs to have power again. Britain cannot continue imagining that the peace dividend is forever. We need to rearm. It's a dangerous world. We're as much at risk from Russia. Look at the range of Russian weapons. We're as much at risk from Russia as they are in Kyiv. We're deluding ourselves if we think we're not, because if NATO is now based on a contingent commitment, if Article 5 is if the president feels like it, we're as much under threat from Russia as Ukraine is. So that's the third thing. Kemi Badenoch is going to be the Thatcher of our time. I've got great confidence in that. If the Conservative Party has the guts to back her, she is the only person I have seen in the modern Conservative Party with the intellectual firepower that Margaret Thatcher had, the genuine curiosity, the interest in ideas that has been utterly absent in the leadership of the party for years, has a genuine courage. She has guts. And that's also rare, I'm afraid, in the British Conservative Party. And that was the thing that Margaret Thatcher had that we desperately need now. So we just need to get behind her. Her instincts are aligned with mine. The economy, the free market, the individual and the family, and a strong national defence. That's the essential ingredients. That's what she aspires to. And if you're not with her, you're against her.
My only regret is that Kemi isn't speaking for another hour, so because that would have been the absolute. We should bring you back just to be a hype man. But thank you so very much to both of you, and thank you all. And the next panel before Kemi's appearance will be on the policy challenge, and I think we may even be hearing about the NHS. So.
Excellent. Thank you.
Public service reform.
How are you? I missed what he said.
He was saying no one here is going to talk about the NHS.
Should we sit in order?
What order would you like us?
Any order you like.
Okay. Why not?
Nice, I'm in the middle. Great.
Oh.
Bloody hell, it's a bit bright, isn't it?
I better go and sit there. We'll talk about it when we've got time. Yeah. So, yeah. Now, shall I try kicking off?
Hello, love.
We've got the real...
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, should we take our seats?
Go and sit over there. Thank you. That's fine.
It's all about taking back control from the stage. Do sit down. So much more fun to have today. Thank you so much, everybody. My name's Kamal Ahmed. I'm the Director of Audio at The Telegraph and presenter of the Daily Tea podcast. If you have not subscribed to it, you are both foolish and missing out. My fantastic co-presenter, Camilla Tominey, is in the audience, waving there. We're on every day at 5 o'clock, but that's enough plugs. But given that we sponsored this thing, I think I'm allowed to have a couple of minutes. So thank you very kindly for that. I am joined by a quite superb set of brains to discuss the policy issues around the future of conservatism. To my left, I don't know whether that's politically or not, is Rachel Wolfe, founding partner of Public First. Welcome, Rachel. Dr. Lawrence Newport, founder of Looking for Growth. Somewhat difficult exercise for the present Chancellor. Matt Ridley, board member, the Prosperity Institute, and very fine author. Sold over 1 million copies. And he's also a Newcastle United supporter. Given that you can hear in my voice, my thick Scouse accent. I was at the match yesterday with my son, supporting the losing side. And Adrian Wooldridge, global business columnist, Bloomberg. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to chat away here, and then literally the leader of the opposition is going to come on and say, they have nailed it. That is the future of conservatism. Now, I have, along with my co-presenter Camilla Tominey, a yellow band on my wrist, because Camilla and I, this morning, were at Nigel Farage's most recent press conference, where he announced 29 councillors who would be defecting to reform, the majority of whom were formerly, at some point in their careers, Conservative councillors. There was one Liberal Democrat and one Labour councillor who were also on the stage at the event in Westminster. Part of the whole discussion about conservatism, of course, is a discussion about reform. So did Camilla and I go from the sublime to the ridiculous, the sublime to the sublime, the ridiculous to the sublime, or the ridiculous to the ridiculous? Who knows? Rachel, why are the Conservatives on 21% in the polls?
I think that's quite an easy question to answer, because over a period of years, the Conservative Party made a series of promises to the electorate on things that mattered to them and broke every single one of them. They promised they'd reduce migration. It went through the roof. They promised to take back control, including on borders. Illegal migration went through the roof. They promised to rebuild hospitals. The NHS collapsed in terms of productivity and output. They promised to level up the country, and towns became even more distressed than they had been before the previous election. So it would be remarkable if the electorate did not want to punish them at the last election, and I think it will take a very long time under any leader for the electorate to be convinced that it is worth trusting the Conservatives again. I suppose to your question of the ridiculous, the sublime, I think relatively little of this has to do with Reform's performance, although without a figurehead like Farage, perhaps it wouldn't coalesce. They seem quite plausibly like they're going to throw away their advantage through an inability to behave with basic competence. But I don't think it's any mystery at all why the Conservatives are on 21%.
Now, Rachel, you were literally one of the co-authors of the 2019 manifesto. What I struggle to understand, having viewed politics for many decades, is just how the Conservatives got so many things that appeared so obvious that if you got them wrong, you would struggle in an election to get so many of them wrong. Claire Watson, who's another of our presenters on the Daily Tea, who was in Theresa May's, Boris Johnson's number 10, said that Boris Johnson found it almost sort of wasn't something he'd actually do, was deny or have controversy around it. So if anyone came in and said, that's the wrong idea, he would say, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, I feel terrible. What was the problem with the Conservatives after 2019 when they won so well that led to all those diseases? And what can the present Conservatives learn from that?
So I'll give some charitable reasons and then some less charitable reasons. So the charitable one is we are not unique. Every single major incumbent government through COVID and the energy crisis in Ukraine has been punished badly in the last few years. And almost every single equivalent Western nation has made the same, in my view, bad decisions around migration that the UK has. So we are hardly unique. And the other charitable reason, semi-charitable reason I would give is there's no question that COVID, that we've all forgotten now, COVID made it a lot harder. There was a lot of progress that could have been made fairly rapidly after the 2019 election that wasn't. I think the two special reasons I will add, and others might have them, is one, we really did over 14 years, but then very radically over 5, go through every conceivable flavour of Conservative Prime Minister and Conservative ideology, and every new Prime Minister that came in cared more about stamping their own ideological view on the government than any form of kind of consistency or delivery. So it is not surprising that absolutely everything was a mess. When I think about when I was first involved in government, it was very much the period of public service reform, education reform, which I think went very well, health reform less so. All of that was junked as these kind of messes went in. And then the really uncharitable reason is I don't think Boris really ever internalised that it mattered that he'd made these promises and needed to keep them. And it mattered.
There's an ethics question. Adrian, let me come to you. Why are the Conservatives on 21% in the polls?
Why that specific number? Or why
why are they third?
Why are they so low?
Well, maybe that specific number. Why are they third in the polls in the main parties?
Why are they so high? Let me answer that in a very abstract way. I think there's a general crisis that we're seeing around the world at the moment of centre-left and centre-right politics. And the Conservatives are suffering from that crisis because they were the party in government for the last 14 years. And that is a crisis that's brought on by the fact that governments in the West have tried to embrace two forms of liberalism or two forms of neoliberalism. One is social neoliberalism and the other is economic neoliberalism. And they've tried to embrace them and bring them together. This was the legacy of Mrs Thatcher plus the legacy of Tony Blair. And the thinking was you could put these two things together and you would be able to form a sustainable governing coalition. And that has failed. And it's most obviously and dramatically failed over immigration, because it was very laissez-faire about immigration, and it turned out that didn't work very well. But it's failed over a whole set of other things, and one of the most important of those things at the moment is the regulation of the internet, I think, where we've had a very laissez-faire attitude, and that's producing massive social problems. So I think all governments around the world that have tried to combine these two things together have ultimately failed, and you're getting governments coming into power that are trying very, very different things, most obviously Trump, but also various other formulations around the world. And as long as we try and put those two things together and don't think more seriously about whether they complement each other or don't complement each other, about whether we can continue with this paradigm or what other things we need to put into that mixture, as long as you keep doing that, you will not form a sustainable government.
And is your sense that one of the great joys of the CPS, so any of us who've studied politics as I did, the CPS and Keith Joseph and the work that was done in the lead up to Margaret Thatcher's victory in 1979 gave us a deep political, economic and philosophical grounding to a project from the right, which broke the Keynesian consensus, which had been extant post the Second World War.
Quite.
I believe that the major issue for the right of politics in the UK is that it has struggled to reimagine that type of work in a modern context. Who is it that Kemi Badenoch turns to who are the same as Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, whoever it might be? Do you feel there's an intellectual underpinning to what Kemi is trying to do?
One argument is that we just need to go back to Mrs Thatcher. We had the end of the Keynesian consensus. We had Thatcherism coming along. Then we had Tony Blair coming along and adding social liberalism to that mixture. I don't think we just need to go back to Thatcherism. I think we need to find a new balancing between these two things. Mrs Thatcher had a sort of balancing because she was both a Manchester liberal and a conservative, and she believed in institutions to counterbalance that. And what we then moved on to was Blair, who destroyed a lot of those institutions. I think we need to find a new way of balancing the power of and creative destruction of capitalism with a set of more communal constraints that don't mean going back to the 1970s, but do put some sort of more value on community, continuity, history and tradition. And I would say that is being enormously demonstrated at the moment by the issue of immigration, which underlines completely the collapse of the neoliberal consensus around the world, but is also, and I think as a growing thing, is the power and destructive creating power of the internet and of social media. So it's a new balancing. It's not just going back to Thatcherism. No. It's going forward from Thatcherism to a new synthesis.
Matt, when you have a look at the Conservatives now, one of your areas of deep expertise is the discussion around climate change and how that has so infected and affected political debate for the last 2 decades. We had David Cameron, which George Osborne was reminding us of, vote blue, go green, hug a husky. We were arguing whether it was hug a husky or hug a hoodie. I think it was actually both he wanted to hug, so a lot of hugging going on with David. Just on that maybe specifically first, but then more broadly, was that one of the areas where the Conservatives lost a bit of their anchor? Because the tone around the challenges, if they are there, of climate change, became indistinguishable from the general centre-left and centre-right consensus. They became the same thing.
Yes, and I think I want to be able to link it to what Adrian just said, because I think it's quite an illustrative example. And I want to pick one specific policy and show you what I mean, and that is the zero-emission vehicle policy, the ZEV programme, which we've got at the moment, which is essentially Rishi Sunak's policy in the sense that he tried to relax the existing mandate saying that we had to be all electric by, in terms of new car sales by 2030. He pushed it back to 2035, but at the same time he agreed that there would be intermediate targets. So last year we were supposed to sell 24% of new vehicles as electric cars, and this year 28%. Now, that is Stalinism of the most unbelievably centralised, nonsensical kind, because what happens if people don't turn up and buy them?
What was Rishi Sunak doing then, putting those types of targets?
Well, this is where I want to link it to what Adrian said, because it's being far too dirigiste in an economic area, and he's right, we're not dirigiste enough in some cultural and other areas. So the Manchester liberalism is needed back in the economy, and some more conservatism in the social area would be one recipe that I can suggest. I mean, just to drum home how mad these mandates are, if you're making electric cars in this country and you can't sell enough, if you're making cars and you can't sell enough of them because people want diesels. I just bought a diesel, for example. Partly because you don't save any emissions. Yeah. I mean, you've got to drive 100,000 miles before you save any emissions at all in some countries, about 50,000 miles in this country. So it's a sort of nonsensical thing anyway. But if you're a manufacturer and you're selling these things, you don't sell enough, you're fined £15,000 per vehicle, right? Unless you find someone else who's finding it easier to sell electric vehicles, in which case you can somehow they get the money. So what we've done is we're effectively subsidising Chinese car makers at the expense of British ones. That's mad on all sorts of levels.
That's a symptom.
And
is that a symptom that underlines why the Conservatives are languishing at a position in the polls
Yes, I think so,
that we haven't seen almost historically?
Because back to your original question, the climate change stroke energy agenda got pulled way to the left and way to the statist end of the left. The idea that it was absolutely centralised government decision-making that was going to solve all these problems. And embodied in the Climate Change Act of 2008 by Ed Miliband as Energy Secretary, accepted by Cameron Osborne, strengthened by Theresa May in terms of the 2050 mandate, 2050 net zero mandate, and embodied into this terrifying organisation called the Climate Change Committee, which has enormous power and is beyond the reach, as far as I can see, of any kind of democratic accountability for these policies. Whether you like it or not, that's been happening in lots of areas. The whole point of setting up NHS England was to try and shove off the responsibility onto a technocratic expert body, just like the Climate Change Committee, just like Natural England in a different environmental sphere, etc. And that policy has been a disaster because it's empowered the technocratic, self-electing, unaccountable blob at the expense of accountable politicians, and it hasn't actually taken away any of the blame. The blame still comes to the elected politicians, even though the decisions are mostly taken, £100 million bat tunnels for HS2 and things like that. That then would get me into a disquisition on the planning system, if you wanted.
Yes, which we might get to. So we're just trying to diagnose maybe what the problems are before we can get on to maybe some of the solutions.
Sorry, can I just add?
Yes.
The other key point of all this, of course, is that we've driven up the price of electricity to the highest of any nation in the OECD. We're beating Germany. We're top of the league for both industrial and domestic electricity prices. What a triumph. This is madness. Energy is the lifeblood of productivity, of manufacturing, of services, of the new AI economy, of everything. It is really, really worrying that we are now an extremely expensive energy country.
Lawrence, your analysis, your organisation looking for growth, your analysis of where the Conservatives, we're just focusing at the moment on where it's gone wrong. We're going to move into some areas of possible solutions, given that the Leader of the Opposition is going to arrive shortly. But where have and did the Conservatives go wrong?
So I think energy prices is one to really pick up on. I mean, really, it's difficult to talk about precisely where they got wrong because there were so many things over the last 5 to 14 years that has led to a world in which we have sky-high energy prices, wages have been stagnant basically since 2008. We've found, of course, services that, though they might get more money, they still are not, we're not seeing certainly better quality of services. People are extremely frustrated and extremely angry. They're being taxed more than ever and not seeing the results from it. We have institutions that we call, the blob or otherwise, which they completely failed to deal with. And then we'll talk about how difficult they were, and my God, could somebody do something about this? They had a parliamentary majority, and Parliament is perhaps like the most powerful parliament on earth. They can do basically anything. My concern as a young legal academic was, my goodness, the amount of power held in the House of Commons is so unbelievable. Surely we are waiting any moment now for a tyrant, and in fact it's completely opposite. They're just not using that power. It is astounding to me, and history is strange for that fact. But we saw years and years of this, that, the blob is very difficult, it's very difficult to get around, and even now, the current government has had the same diagnosis, which I think is unexpected, but somehow when it comes from them, it feels a bit more like, oh, something's going to happen here. We don't know, we haven't seen it yet. We've seen a little bit actually with NHS England. Maybe we'll see some more. But there is obviously a lot of foundational and fundamental things that have just gone completely wrong. The fact that we haven't built new energy infrastructure, the fact that it's so difficult to build in this country full stop, the fact that, the Bat Tunnel thing is just an example of all of the ways in which we've thrown up as many roadblocks as possible, and not only did they fail to get rid of them, they added to some of these, right? Like, that's all the problems, and they piled up and piled up and piled up. And eventually the electorate have obviously gotten annoyed enough that they voted to completely change that, one of the worst results in like 200 years, and still, I think it is a question of just getting back to, I think there's loads of good questions about the kind of the intellectual roots and where to go next. I think it's a really, really good question. But it's just the basic stuff is it kind of doesn't matter to an extent what the academic or even spiritual pushes. If you can't do things, which was one of the chief complaints before, that's where you should start, right? It's like, well, we can't build anything, so even if we've got ideas, we can't make them real, and we've got an entire set of institutions that we know from 14 years or so forth has been so difficult, we couldn't get anything through, or at least that's what we told ourselves. I do think in part this is true, this is very, very difficult, you have to come up against so many barriers all the time. That stuff is like step one. So I think this is exactly right, but I think it also needs just a direct analysis, like what stopped us doing stuff and how do we repair that.
Can I just say one thing, though? Because in one area we did get things through. I say the Conservatives did get things through, and that was education. We had a set of education policies which were extremely successful, really quite popular, which to some extent consolidated the policies of Mrs Thatcher and Tony Blair, but went against a lot of the preconceptions of the blob, brilliantly championed, brilliantly argued for by Michael Gove. So it proves you can get things through if you have good people who believe sensible things. So it's more...
Isn't that right, Lawrence? So this sort of complaint about the blob, our columnist Philip Johnston wrote about this just before Keir Starmer's speech about the smaller state, which I think he describes the civil service as too often living in a tepid bath of underachievement or something around that sort of line. And Philip Johnston wrote, it's very convenient for politicians to blame the systems that they set up and that they are responsible for controlling. And I think there was a lot of sympathy from Telegraph readers who commented on Philip's brilliant piece that politicians have just sort of said, well, somehow it's not our fault or our issue. And exactly as you say, Adrian, you look at education policy, and it has been effective. And one of the most sort of oddly depressing moments of the last 4 days was when Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, on the announcement that the Labour government was going to get rid of NHS England, a quango, the world's biggest quango, put in place by Andrew Lansley, a Conservative health secretary. I wish we had done that. And the sort of weakness of that position, given that literally Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch were in the government only less than a year ago, I think that's one of the reasons why the Conservatives are on 21% in the polls. But Lawrence, and then Matt.
Yeah, I mean, it's far from an excuse. In fact, I'd say the opposite. They had control of the most powerful parliament on earth, and they're like, oh, there's a few bureaucrats in my way. I mean, you can make and remake institutions. You actually have that power. You have that ability. It is the fact that if things are grinding to a halt, if there's difficulties, then you have the authority and ability to change those things. It is exactly true that in education, really good stuff actually happened, and that did take a lot of effort and a lot of energy. And it's in part also being able to say, well, how do we keep those bars? There should be some bar. Like, it shouldn't be every kind of crazy idea that's talked about in the pub suddenly becomes national policy. It is the case, of course, that you do want to lower the barrier from the point where it looked like most ideas went nowhere, most stuff took forever, and that change couldn't happen, to the point that they felt that it was an excuse to say, oh, I can't get things through, it's too difficult. Like, that does talk about a need to change things. And the current government have said the same thing, right? They've met the same exact barriers faster than I think they thought they would. In fact, I I think their attitude was something like, the civil service is great, filled with amazing people, and, la, la, la. And then suddenly realizes, oh, actually, there are some amazing people here, but there's also just a lot of sludge you have to walk through, a lot of difficulty to get anything done, and this is going to kill our government, like it did the last one.
Yeah. Matt?
Well, I would just like to say that I think both the Conservatives and their critics are still making a fundamental mistake in understanding what the nature of this thing, the blob, is. It isn't that it gets up in the morning, reads The Guardian and hates them, although there's quite a lot of that too. But that isn't the sort of main problem. The main problem is that the National Paperclip Authority, we think that its job is to get paperclips to every high street in the country in an as efficient a way as possible. It isn't. Its job is to maximise the budget of the National Paperclips Authority. That's what it wakes up in the morning trying to do. And if necessary, it's going to creep its mission and expand its remit to make sure that it maximises its budget. And until you sort of get that basic C. Northcote Parkinson, Mancur Olson idea into politicians' heads, I think they're going to misdiagnose the nature of the enemy. And the chairman of the National Paperclips Authority is going to make marvellous speeches about how vital his job is and vital that we don't get rid of this extremely important institution. And on the whole, people are going to believe in him because they're going to take him on the issue of paperclips, not the issue of his authority.
Yes. Now, Rachel.
By the way, it doesn't exist. Sorry.
No, I tell you, yeah. And the MP for wherever the headquarters are of the National Paperclips, whatever, will be furious if they're going to close it down. So that's also always another problem. Now, Rachel, you've worked in the States as well as working here. I do want to push us on to what might be described as the Trump effects. From your work, I mean, it was in the private sector, senior vice president of a technology company called Amplify. What does that do? In case no one's heard of it.
I'm sure they have. It's an education technology company.
Fantastic. So, involved in education work. Let's just talk a little bit about the Trump effect. One Trump effect I think has happened, which I think is a danger for the Conservatives, is that Keir Starmer, after a pretty miserable self-inflicted first 6 months in power, appalling polling numbers, lack of sort of political coherence, sees an opportunity with Donald Trump, which he has grabbed with both hands. I wrote in November, the day after the election, that it was Keir Starmer's get-out-of-jail card, and I think so it has been proved. He's just wrenched the party rightwards as fast as he can, trying to get some momentum in ripping up planning law, getting rid of things like, NHS England and West Streeting, saying there's lots more to come, raising defence spending, cutting international development. Tomorrow we've got the big benefits announcement, which is going to be very controversial to the left, which actually I think it's a fight Keir Starmer is probably quite glad to have because it positions the Labour Party as much more centrist than many of the voters imagined they were in the first 6 months. But Rachel, is that a reasonable analysis? And what does Trump say that could help the Conservatives here? Because there's also the slightly confusing way that it has led to people to question, many Telegraph readers to question, well, where is reform on the issue of Putin, for example? So there's odd cross-currents here. A lot of people thought Trump must be good for Farage because he's shown that you can win from the kind of radical, disruptive right. That must be a great thing. But actually, hang on a minute, Ukraine, Russia, that's not quite what we want in the UK. 80% of people polled in the UK have said that a sovereign Ukraine is important to the UK. We are much more negative about Putin than Trump or even Farage possibly is. So there's lots of cross-currents here, aren't there? The Trump effect.
Yeah, I mean, Trump is chaos by instinct and design, and so I assume he will carry on being chaos for the next few years and will inflict chaos on the countries, which is the whole world that has to deal with him. Honestly, I think that Starmer has done much better in the last few weeks than I would have guessed. Having been, I think, the most woeful start of a government in my lifetime with the level of political capital they had and the number of completely unforced own goals they made, He has made a number of decisions in the last few weeks that were both necessary and has set the entire right-wing think tank world sort of to gnashing their teeth because they wish that the Conservatives had made some of these decisions. I don't think you can doubt that. And he has shown a willingness that I don't think the Conservative Party always showed to take on his own side. And think it is probably true that most successful prime ministers have to be willing to take on their own side as much as the opposition. I don't think we should forget, though, and then am I allowed to talk about school reform briefly at the end?
Yes, I would love to.
I want to know. We shouldn't forget, though, what fundamentally is going to drive people's votes and happiness with the government in a few years. And it is going to remain the things that drove their votes and happiness with the government last year, which is, can they get a GP appointment? Will the ambulance turn up? Can they get their kids educated? Are they going to get robbed as they walk down the street? And are wages improving, on which the last I don't think Trump's going to help very much. So for all the kind of noise and fury and what is driving, and immigration, and what is driving sort of these questions around Ukraine, I think truthfully for the performance of the government and its success in the next election, they're secondary. Just quickly on school reform, because I ran the free school programme when Michael Gove was Education Secretary, and I worked on it in opposition. I just want to talk briefly about why that worked, because I don't think it is purely because Michael is competent, although it is partly because Michael is competent. The first, which is worth us remembering, is it's because all of the work was done in opposition. The bills were drafted, everyone was talked to, everyone knew what they were going to do. The second was that the entire principle of the education reforms was to generate self-sustaining autonomy at school level, so that there was, in effect, a new blob. There are lots and lots of schools around the country that are absolutely excellent, that parents want to send their children to, that are a defence against rolling back change. It's not a perfect defence, because as Lawrence says, if you have enough of a majority in government, you can destroy anything. But some defence, and I think that kept it going more than some other reforms. I also don't think we should forget how nearly a total catastrophe it was. The person everyone thought was going to get fired in the first few months of the 2010 Cameron government was Michael Gove. Because building schools for the future, do you remember that? Was cancelled. The civil servants kept providing the wrong lists. It was all embarrassing. Everything looked like it was chaos. And that is both a reminder that government dysfunction of that kind is not new, and it took some will, I think, from the Cameron to keep going through. But also, if you don't have a very clear plan over a number of years about what reform is precisely going to look like, down to detail, it is inordinately unlikely to succeed. And you have to do it consistently, which is why I think what we did with health was not only catastrophic in the original Lansley reforms and the creation of NHS England, but again, we've moved from trying to carry on choice of a kind of Blairite side through to the most massive centralisation of the NHS, not only through NHS England, but through the integrated care service that we've ever seen under a Conservative party, to endlessly kind of rewiring how we think that its interaction with social care and other things are going to work. We just didn't make any decisions that we stuck to.
Rachel, it's interesting about this policy work, because, of course, Lansley... Am I right in thinking that Lansley was the longest-serving shadow health secretary?
It doesn't help if the ideas are bad.
Well, yes, that's the point. You might do all the policy work you want to, which he did in depth for years, and it was still useless. So you have to be careful with that. Can I just push you a little bit, Rachel, on the Trump effect? Because I think you're absolutely right that what you might describe as the sort of kitchen table issues is what, in the end, people vote on. But, Adrian, I want to come to you just after, Rachel. But, Adrian, I know you've written about the role of the disruptor as being actually it's sort of a cross-politics idea. It's not about right or left, it's just about the ability, and Neil Ferguson and George Osborne spoke about this a little, this ability to just make noise in the right way to sound like you're doing something. And I think that that is an interesting part of the political conversation now, which all parties have to learn from. But just on policy terms, Rachel, has Trump opened up any new avenues to Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives and how they might be thinking about, not that chaos is the strategy, I think that's probably, it's a difficult leap. We're not the same as America for many, many very obvious reasons, but is there something about the way you communicate or what you communicate about that Trump could teach us?
So I think what has happened is we always imbibe American culture, and we always convince ourselves Britain is more like America than it is. We did that for a number of years on, I guess, what you call the cultural left. So we saw what was happening in the States, and we assumed Britain was the same, and we started talking about it in the same language at an elite level. And I think the same has happened in reverse, in that I think the political elites of the UK now feel a freedom to talk on the cultural right, because America is in a way that they didn't before. I think that is mostly, but not entirely, helpful, because Britain isn't America. And actually, we do not have quite the same cultural divides that they do. But I do think, broadly, it is probably a good thing that UK politicians now feel able to talk about everything from immigration to woke in a way that 2 years ago felt impossible. And I think that is largely due to Trump.
If you go back to the foundation of the Centre for Policy Studies back in the late 1970s, one of the most striking things is that you had a very close alliance between the Republican Party and the Conservative Party. You had a common set of problems and a common set of solutions to those problems. That's not the case now.
No.
I mean, you couldn't, you know, if the Tory Party decides to get as close as possible to Donald Trump, it will lose the next election.
Yeah, that would be a catastrophe.
The big problem for the Reform Party is precisely that it's so close to Donald Trump, partly because of Russia, but also because disruption can be a big problem. It's a big problem if it destroys the value of your 401k and your savings account and drives the stock market down. So I think the worst thing that's what looked to be the best thing for Farage, which was the relationship with Trump, is now becoming and will continue to be a big problem.
Can I come in on that, Adrian? I agree with you at the level of sort of top politics, but I think below that there is much more of an opportunity to emulate and push on with the same kind of things as happened in America. I'm thinking about wokery and I'm thinking about greenery, mainly.
Right.
I think it's easily possible that the courage to take on those agendas has been instilled into Britain by what happened in America last year, and to show that actually taking on the trans issue did actually probably push Trump over the threshold in a number of states. I don't know if that's accurate political analysis, but it could be true. And that therefore, if you are the kind of person who wants either the Conservative Party or the Reform Party to be more muscular in its pushback on, pronouns and not gas boilers, the other ones, the heat pumps, then you probably have taken some comfort from what happened in America, and that will help you.
I guess the one thing I just want to stress, I don't think you would disagree with this, maybe you would, is just that is not a substitute for figuring out how you are going to convince people that they will get a GP appointment and you will control your borders and you will limit migration and schools are going to work. And we partly do this because we care about it. We partly do it bluntly because it's easy. It's really easy to rhetorically talk about this stuff, and it is hard to talk about the things that people care about because we don't know all the answers and we haven't done the hard work. I don't want people to kid themselves that it is a substitute.
I think that's the big... There's huge opportunity in this. I think you're entirely correct that there's huge opportunity in being able to talk about issues much more sensibly, much more calmly. But there is also the temptation to not look at the foundational problems, which we keep hitting over and over again, which is you can't see your doctor. Phones are nicked outside of your hands whenever you leave any building. Your bikes are gone en masse all the time.
Productivity is flatlining. Yeah. That's the really
wages are stagnant. So we've set up chapters across the country at LFG, and one of them, there was somebody in the Bristol chapter. He was 25 years old, and he said, "I am 25 years old, and all I've ever known is decline. What can I do?" That's the state of things, right? Like that's the level of upset, that's the level of anger, and I think there are a whole bunch of other issues that we can now kind of talk about or discuss, but really the key is being able to talk to those people and say, yes, things have been really, really bad. Here is the path out. here's what we see out, here's what we are going to enable to happen, and here's what we're going to make sure, or here's how we're going to make sure that things don't get in our way and that it's actually done, so that you don't have to look at another 5 to 10 years of just constant decline, stagnant wages, higher bills. This is completely unsustainable, completely terrible, and that will be ultimately what drives people to vote in the next 5 years, and it won't be kind of wider issues, which in the US I think they have more leeway to talk about, because frankly they're not doing nearly as badly economically as we're doing. We are in full decline, and as a part of that we have to get the grips with that. Everything else is additive.
Well, Lawrence, can I just come in? Adrian, one second.
I was just going to say that the US was doing really, really well economically until Trump came in. Then the economy took
yes, but Lawrence, the challenge to that is that Kemi, if the right does that work, the biggest nervousness of any opposition party is that the government just nick your ideas. So if you're thinking about crime and mobile phones and getting a GP's appointment and what Wes Streeting has done about GP's appointment, no longer the 8 a.m. rush, he has said, of course these things need to be tested. Do they actually work? The state should be smaller. Lots of ways that those things can be tested. But if Kemi Badenoch comes out with a set of policy proposals, this government, as we have seen, let's not forget, Keir Starmer was a person who, within the last decade, has suggested that Jeremy Corbyn would be the best Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and since then has been on a pretty rapid journey into the sensible centre, if nothing more than that at this stage, of politics. Lawrence, isn't the problem that is that going to be enough of a prospectus? You do need a broader narrative about why is the right different from this bloke in number 10?
Yeah, I think there's those things which they can, like I say, that's additive. And I don't think all the things that, for instance, the current government is going to be able to actually do. There's a lot of things which ideologically they're basically opposed to that are going to need to be necessary, that Conservatives are kind of more naturally at home with, perhaps, but haven't done and failed to do, right, for 14 years. And that's partly actually something that has to be made clear to the electorate, which is yes, we messed up, here's what we're going to do, here's how we'll make this better. Because really what you're asking is, trust us again. Fool me once, come on, this is
what
very,
are those
very
things, Bob? What are those things that Labour will not do, that Kemi can make hay on, that don't sound better in the mouth of reform?
So, you could do things, for instance, on, partly my work on crime, which actually the Conservatives have been very, very good on picking up on. These are policies which I'm surprised Labour aren't actually jumping on. Very simple stuff, focusing on career criminals, people with 15 or more offences that are responsible for about half of all crime. The fact that they are more likely to avoid prison than any other time since 2007 is completely insane. And basically there's no coalition of voters who think this is a good idea, especially when you see people who've got 200 or more offences. This is something that I did think Labour would be more interested in, and they don't seem to be at all. But this is something which clearly is Conservative, and it's clearly very... we're not asking to imprison everybody on their second offence. These are sensible policies which I think... It's also the case that planning. Labour have started doing work on planning. Is it far enough? No. Is it free market enough? No. There should be stuff that Conservatives feel much more capable and much more comfortable doing.
I think they've got some big space in education. Bridget Phillipson is not connected to what parents want and what pupils need for good outcomes. I think that's going to be one area. Adrian?
I think there's a massive space in education, there's a massive space in energy, but I think, again, there's something more profound here. I think that the neoliberals, people like George Osborne, offered a sort of relatively comfortable hotel that people could stay in. The Labour Party, Keir Starmer, offers improvements to your council house. What the Conservatives should do is offer a home, something that is yours, that is familiar, and that is rooted in the soil and that you want to preserve for the future. That should be the sort of thing. Reform won't be offering that because they're a disruptive party. Labour can't do it because they're the party of the public sector. That is where they should be doing. The sort of the bourgeois virtues need to be reasserted.
Matt, do they need to, I was at the ARC conference a few weeks ago. Jordan Peterson's outfit, of course, importing a lot of thinking from the American right, but also around Europe and Southern America, having Malay, etc. The very clear point that is made by the ARC right, and also to an extent by the sort of Nigel Farage right, are these simple notions of family, faith, flag, stroke community. And those are the principles of the right that the left will never be able to get into because they feel so neuralgic about the notions of patriotism, faith, etc. Do you think, Matt, there are lessons there that the Conservatives can learn from? Again, similar question that I gave to Lawrence, without it simply sounding like you're a kind of Poundland Nigel Farage, because he's always going to be better on that. Or would you say to them, no, you need to be more the type of things that Rachel is saying, the hard yards on the policies that matter around the kitchen table?
Yes, I think probably I would.
Go for faith, family, that type of tone.
Well, I personally am very confused about faith. I think that we've got a very sort of rampant, not very tolerant faith growing in this country, and there's a reaction to it from the Christian right, saying we need to be more Judeo-Christian. I'm not sure that's right. I personally am more of a sort of, I like the classical civilization and the Enlightenment that we invented, neither of which are particularly Judeo-Christian. But that's getting into the weeds of it. What I was more thinking of in answer to your question was the fact that the Shakespeare Birth Trust is to be decolonised, I read in my newspaper this morning, because he's too white or too English or something, or his whole oeuvre is somehow unfair to somebody. Championing that sort of thing and saying, no, we want to be proud of the fact that we produced this unbelievably talented poet in this country 500 years ago, is something that I feel that a Tory party could do if it got its act together and was a bit more courageous about that kind of thing, and stood up to this is back to wokery, of course, but stood up to this long march through the cultural institutions, which is undermining faith in flag, certainly, and family to some extent.
Ruth, I see it's a minute to go before we will clear the stage in readiness for Kemi Badenoch to give us her words, which, wise or otherwise, we don't yet know. Is she somebody who will lead the Conservatives into the next election?
I think it would be completely insane for the Conservatives to try and change their leader.
Lawrence, is Kemi Badenoch the right leader to fight as leader of the Conservatives in the next general election?
I think it's an interesting question about what they're going to do, because the history of the Conservative Party over the last several years has been to ditch people very, very quickly all the time, and I don't think it's done them particularly well. But I think that what they need to focus on is do we have the right people in the right places to deliver the policies that people actually care about and will actually make a difference to people's lives in a net positive way within 5 years.
And is she the person to do that?
We'll see.
Matt, it's a very good politician's answer. Lawrence?
I voted for Kemi Badenoch. I admire Kemi Badenoch. I think she's a person of extraordinary qualities and with a remarkable story and with genuine passion and intellect. But I'm very disappointed by her performance in the first 6 months. I hope that it's going to turn around and come right, and it'll depend on her getting both the policies right and the tone right, and she needs to do that just as much as Keir Starmer needs to do that.
Thank you, Matt. Adrian,
I talked to a very senior Tory the other day, and I asked her this question, her, whoever it was. I asked him, her this question, and her reply was that I'm a bridge player. I believe in playing your losing cards first.
Sorry, say it again, Adrian. You're a bridge player?
No, this person was saying they're a bridge player and they believed in playing their losing cards first.
Right, so Kemi will be maybe the Ian Duncan Smith figure, and then someone else. She may never fight an election, is your slight sense. Brilliant. We are at time. Thank you so much, Adrian, Matt, Lawrence and Rachel, for a brilliant discussion. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, sorry, just while we assemble the auto queue, no expense spared, I just wanted to make a final plug for the CPS and also just fill time. Because George Osborne and Kamal Ahmed are not the only people with successful podcasts, our brilliant CapEx website, which you should all subscribe to the newsletter of, now has a new podcast called The Capitalist, which provides a weekly briefing on all the most important economic and political events in the UK. And beyond, in fact. But I also wanted to, you will have had the flyers on your table, but I also wanted to talk about our annual Margaret Thatcher Fellowship. We launched this at this event last year. The idea was to get people from the world of business early in their careers who wanted to know more about how politics works and maybe even get involved in it. We've had a brilliant cohort who've been able to learn about politics, economics, the media and Westminster, not least over private discussions and seminars with some of the very people who've been speaking so far today. Applications for the next cohort will be opening in the coming days, so if you're interested in applying or know someone who might, please visit our website or talk to any of the fellows that you meet at this event about the experience they've had and why it's a wonderful thing to do. With that, I think, is that the auto cue ready? Is that anything else done? Okay, well, I will... I'll carry on vamping. While I just wait for official confirmation, I should also just say thank you to our incredibly dedicated team at the CPS, both the staff and volunteers, and in particular to my colleagues Emma Revel and Vincent Falea, who have done a fantastic job of organising pretty much everything that's happened today. So thank you so much to them. And with that, I will... Yeah. Yep, they need the mirrors. Yes. So, yeah. So yes, as I said, the auto queue will be assembled, and then Michael Spencer, the chairman of the CPS, will introduce the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, MP. So please continue to enjoy things for the next couple of seconds until that's perfectly in place. Thank you very much.
Kemi reckons it's set a little high. The speaker reckons the auto cue set a little high. Okay. If we could just go a little bit lower back.
So I'm doing the height check. So I'm the same height as Kemi.
Okay, sorry. Give me that down.
What works best?
Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Michael Spencer. I'm chairman of the CPS, and so I'm very pleased to be here this evening to introduce our guest of honour, Kemi Badenoch, who is the leader of the opposition, as you all know, and I won't keep her from you long. But I want to say a big thank you to all of you for supporting this event this evening. I know my dear colleague Robert has done so as well, but from me also, a very, very warm welcome. As all of you know, I hope all of you know, it's 51 years ago since the CPS was founded by Margaret Thatcher and Keith Joseph, and indeed 50 years ago since Thatcher herself became a leader of the Conservative Party. And one is tempted to draw parallels, perhaps, with that and our guests this evening, and hopefully their journeys will be similar. But what Kemi has inherited as leader is a very totally different circumstance than that which Thatcher faced. And we have, as you heard earlier, been through the biggest electoral defeat in the Conservative Party that we have ever had in our 200-year history. And regrettably, it was a deserved defeat. It was a defeat that was driven by a record, certainly over the previous years, of a lamentable unconservative government that delivered net zero, a piece of legislation that I think is disastrous. We started expelling the non-DOMs, another catastrophic economic impact on the country. We had uncontrolled legal immigration, the highest taxes since the Second World War, excess regulation, woeful economic growth, and no reforms whatsoever of any relevance on either welfare or the National Health Service. And the position our good leader, Kemi, is in today, I think we would all describe as highly challenging. But we're here today, Kemi, with friends, and I want you to understand that. These are good friends who want to see you succeed, and we look forward to hearing today more about your personal philosophy, your values, and your political principles. So let the unveil start. The founder of the CPS herself left some very big political footprints behind her. We all hope that you will fill them again. And we will all be with you when you do. Thank you and welcome, Kemi Badenoch.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today we honour Margaret Thatcher. Not just... Ladies and gentlemen, today we honour Margaret Thatcher. Clearly some are still quite terrified by her. Yes, sure. This is just like my election hustings. But it just goes to show that the left still believe that she is to blame for everything that is going wrong in their lives. And that is why it is so critical that all of us here honour Mrs Thatcher, not just as Britain's first female Prime Minister, but as the leader who saved our country from that lot. She didn't arrive in office to manage decline. She came to reverse it. When she took over, Britain was broken. High taxes punished success. Unions held the government hostage. Inflation soared. Businesses collapsed, and the state grew bigger, taking more control over people's lives while delivering less. Before my father died, I remember asking him why he never bought a home in the UK when he could have. And he said to me, no one really wanted to live in the UK in the 1970s. It was a country in decline. So many wealthy people were leaving that their homes were being sold so cheaply. Mrs Thatcher changed all that. She cut taxes, backed business, and gave people the right to own their own homes and build their own futures. She stood firm against socialism, bureaucracy, and decline, and she won. For me, Mrs Thatcher wasn't just a historical figure. She shaped my entire view of politics, of leadership, and of Britain itself. Many of you will know that I was born in London, but I spent much of my childhood in Nigeria, where I saw firsthand what happens when a country embraces socialism and autocracy. There was no Thatcher-style leadership there, no belief in free markets, in personal responsibility, or in hard work being rewarded. Instead, there was corruption, state control, and economic decline. I remember constant power cuts growing up, shortages, and the fear that came with living in a place where the state was strong, but the people were weak. I also remember boys in my class at school mocking girls and telling us our place was in the kitchen. 2 words always shut them up: Margaret Thatcher. When I moved back to the UK as a teenager, I came not to the country in decline that my father remembered, but to a country transformed by Thatcher's revolution, a country that had confidence, energy, and opportunity. I saw what leadership could do, what conservative principles could achieve, and I realised that Britain was special. I became a conservative because I saw what happens when government overreaches, when socialism takes hold, and when the individual is crushed under the weight of bureaucracy and the soft bigotry of low expectations. Margaret Thatcher taught me something powerful. If you want to change a country, you need courage, you need conviction, and you must never, ever back down from doing what is right. That belief has driven me ever since. It drove me in business, it drove me in politics, and it drives me today as leader of the Conservative Party. Lady Thatcher didn't just transform Britain at home. She re-established our country as a global power, not just through economic revival, although she did that, but by standing firm in the world, protecting British interests, and refusing to be bullied. She understood a fundamental truth. A strong nation is clear about who its enemies are and what its interests are. She knew that appeasement never works and that weakness invites aggression. Her decision to send a naval fleet thousands of miles away to reclaim the Falklands Islands was risky. Many in Whitehall advised against it. The UN wanted Britain to negotiate them away. Others thought it wasn't worth the fight. But Mrs Thatcher knew what was at stake. The Falklands were British, and when they were threatened, she didn't hesitate. She stood up for our sovereignty, our people, and our global reputation. She didn't talk, she acted. Compare that to today. Labour is giving British territory away in the Takeoff Islands. Billions of taxpayers' money will be wasted on appeasement, handing over land that is strategically vital, ignoring Chagosians who have proudly waved the Union Jack and proudly proclaimed loyalty to the Crown. The excuses we hear about UN court rulings and electromagnetic signals are nonsense. British territory is British territory. Mrs Thatcher knew that. She defended it. Labour surrenders it. Mrs Thatcher led Britain through the Cold War, a time when our way of life was under direct threat. She was pragmatic about our enemies. She saw the Soviet Union for what it was, a hostile force determined to challenge the West. She didn't hesitate to use economic power as a weapon. She understood that rapid mobilization forces a quicker, more pragmatic resolution than years of war. Would she have supported a moratorium on gas exports that helps Russia? No. Would she have failed to see what's at stake in Ukraine? No. She would have understood, as we must, that we cannot return to a world where enemy states redraw borders through war. A weak Britain emboldens our enemies. A strong Britain, clear in its purpose, keeps us safe. Britain is once again on the wrong path. Labour has returned to the old failed ideas of high spending, high taxes and more government control. The state is bigger than ever, yet failing in its basic duties. Immigration is too high. Crime is rising, businesses are over-regulated and working people are being squeezed. Conservatives have to take responsibility for some of this too. We also have to fix it. We cannot meet this moment with half measures. We must be as bold as Mrs Thatcher was. That is why, under my leadership, the Conservative Party will return to first principles just as she did. Tomorrow, I will be launching the Conservative Party's biggest policy renewal programme in 50 years. We're not announcing detailed policies tomorrow, but we know where we need to get to. We know that we will cut taxes and scrap burdensome regulations so businesses can grow, jobs can be created, and hard work is rewarded. We know we will fight for secure borders and law and order, because a country that cannot defend itself at home or abroad is a country in decline. We know we must shrink the size of the state and end government waste and dependency, because people should decide how to spend their money, not politicians. And we know we must stand up for Britain's values and history, because we should never apologise for our success. Margaret Thatcher understood that you don't fix a broken country by making the state bigger. You fix it by making the people stronger. And that is exactly what the Conservative Party, under my leadership, will do. And it starts with renewal. Just as she rebuilt Britain, we must renew our party, rebuild our country, and save our future. Margaret Thatcher didn't fight to make Britain comfortable with decline. She fought to make it great again. Britain's future will not be written by the socialists shouting in the audience. It will not be written by the bureaucrats or the do-mongers. It will be written by us. I wouldn't be standing here today as the leader of the Conservative Party without Margaret Thatcher's legacy. To be honest, none of us would have heard of the Centre for Policy Studies if she had failed. It is our job now to make sure that we all here today live up to her legacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kemi, and thank you all, with two exceptions, for joining us here today. I hope you've found it as interesting and thought-provoking as we intended. Please, if you are joining us for drinks and dinner afterwards, then please make your way through behind me. If you're not, please don't fake your way through it. Well, we do have a list of people. But if you're, for everyone who's come, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope to see you again at future CPS events, because we do this once a year, but the work of policy making and opinion forming and research goes on every single day. And it's wonderful to have your support and engagement with that process. So thank you all so much.